Hi, my name is Leon Sultan. I'm an AP Human Geography teacher at Abraham Lincoln High School in San Francisco, California. Welcome to the lecture called Introduction to Political Geography, States and Nations. This is based on topic 4.1, Introduction to Political Geography. We're going to talk a lot about different political entities and contemporary examples. So the first thing we're going to do is retrain our thinking. We think of this map as natural. This is the map that we've always seen. All the countries are different colors. There's lines on the map. This is the way it is. But we have to retrain ourselves to understand that this map is not a natural occurring thing. All of the lines on this map are borders, and the borders of the world were created by humans and reflect unique historical, cultural, economic, and political circumstances. These are not naturally occurring borders. They're drawn by humans. The political map of the world is constantly changing. This is what it looked like in 2012. This is what it looked like in 1900. It was quite different. We're also going to have to train ourselves to understand terms in a new way. When we think of the word country, we think of what we're going to be calling state. For this class, a country just means a physical place. A nation means a group of people, and a state is a political entity or a political organization of space. So what we used to call countries, we now call state. When we're talking about the areas inside the borders on the world map, we're going to use the term state, not country and not nation. So what makes a state? Well, a state has 4 elements, and we're going to unpack each one of these. Permanent population, government, international recognition, defined territory, and territorial sovereignty. So the first is pretty self-explanatory. In order to be considered a state, you need to have a permanent population, people or citizens. You also need to have a government. A government is just a body that governs in some way. It doesn't need to be elected. It could be a dictatorship. Any type of government will do to be considered a state. You also need international recognition. That means that other states in the world and the United Nations recognize you as a state and recognize your sovereignty or ability to control your own territory. So here are some examples of places that are very close to being states but lack international recognition. So Palestine is one example. Palestine, or the Palestinian territories, has almost everything that it needs to be a state, but unfortunately there are many states or countries in the world that have not recognized the state of Palestine. So it has not achieved statehood in that classic sense. The same is true for Kosovo. Kosovo is not truly a state because there are many states in the world that have not recognized Kosovo's independence. So it operates as a semi-autonomous region of Serbia. More on that later. The next thing that a state needs is territorial sovereignty. That means having control over your own space. And here's an example of control over your own space with government officials stopping cars on a highway. Another example of control over space would be police controlling the space outside of a capital. But to be considered a state, you need to have territorial sovereignty or control over your own space. Now, territoriality, according to geographer Robert Sack, is the attempt by an individual or group to affect, influence, or control people, phenomena, relationships by delimiting and asserting control over a geographic area. Okay? So territoriality is when a state attempts to control their own area. Here are some examples of territoriality in the United States. By flying the flag and putting the flag everywhere in the US, that's an example of territoriality. By building a wall on the border with Mexico, that's asserting control over territory, and that's enforcing control over territory, and that's territoriality. By having mandatory school and by having school taught in a specific language, that's maintaining control over space. So that's an example of territoriality. Another example could be in a remote region, like in the region of Hana in Hawaii on the island of Maui. It's a pretty remote space, but the United States maintains a presence there by having a post office. So that's another example of having control over space. More recent examples would be the protests in downtown Portland that happened in 2020. So this is protesters exerting control over downtown Portland. Now the reaction from the state was to re-exert control over this same space. So this is another example of territoriality. Okay, we're going to switch gears and look at the term nation. Nations are very different than states because nations are cultural entities, meaning that they are made up of individuals who have forged a common identity through a shared language, religion, ethnicity, or heritage. Or it could be all four of these. So it's really a group of people. What elements create a shared national identity? Every state has different nationalities, and every nationality has a different characteristics that make up their identity. What does it mean to be an American? What makes up our shared national identity? So we have state and nation. Those are our two terms right now. State being politically organized space, and nation being a group of people. Now let's combine the two. Now we have a nation state. A nation state is when all the people in a state belong to the same nation. So the geography of where these people live corresponds to the borders and the politically organized space of their state. Some examples. While there are no true nation states in the world, all states have at least one ethnic minority group, but there are some states that are very close with almost a full nation of people within their borders who correspond with a shared identity. So an example would be Iceland. Another example is Japan, and finally Estonia. All of those are pretty ethnically homogeneous places that correspond pretty closely to the nation-state ideal. Okay, now a multinational state means a state with many different nations of people living within it. So for this example, imagine each color is a different nation of people, and then we go ahead and draw these random borders or boundaries on the state. Now I can see that there are many, many different nationalities within my state. So some real world examples of multinational states would be Iraq, where in the north it's Kurdish people or Sunni Kurds. In the south you have Shia, and in the middle you have a lot of Sunni Arabs. In addition, there are smaller ethnic groups like Yazidi and Turkoman. Another example would be Nigeria. Within Nigeria, we have many ethnic groups. The dominant ethnic group in the north would be Hausa Fulani, and in the south, Yoruba. But in addition, there's Igbo, Ija, Tiv, and others. And of course, the United States is a multinational state with several hundred different recognized Native American groups who are their own nations. And really, most states in the world today are multinational states. Now, a multi-state nation is a nation of people who are distributed across multiple states. So if we imagine the green being one ethnic group or one nation of people, and the black lines representing borders, we would see that this is a nation of people distributed across multiple states. One example of this would be Russian people, and there's Russian people in Russia, but there's also large groups of ethnic Russians in Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and some of the Baltic states. Now, additionally, the Kurds or Kurdish people are a nation of people who are distributed across multiple states, in this case, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and even small populations in Armenia. The Kurds are an example of a stateless nation. This is a nation of people who do not have their own independent state of their own. Two other examples are found in Spain, the Basque people, and the Catalan people, both of whom identify as a nation, but do not have their own sovereign state. Okay, now additionally, within sovereign states, there may be autonomous or semi-autonomous regions. These are regions that are given some authority to govern their own territories independently from the national government. So an example of that in the United States are Indian reservations, who have autonomy within their reservations, but they do not have sovereignty because they are still part of the United States, and ultimately the United States has sovereignty even over these lands. An example of this would be the DAPL Dakota Access Pipeline and the protest that occurred there because indigenous people were not being given sovereignty over their lands. Another example would be Hong Kong. Now, Hong Kong is a part of the People's Republic of China, and they operate as a semi-autonomous region with some local control, But there's a limit to that local control, as we saw last year, and this year, with massive protests against crackdowns by the government in Beijing occurring throughout Hong Kong. The modern concept of a state really originates in Europe around the 1600s with the Peace of Westphalia, and eventually it diffuses all around the world through colonialism. Here on this map, we can see the different dates of independence and the trends for states in the world. As you can see in the Americas, most states in the Americas gained independence sometime between 1750 and 1939, while in sub-Saharan Africa, we can see independence was granted after the 1940s, as it was in South Asia, much of the Middle East, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. Whereas in Western Europe, many of these states were independent before 1750 and others independent between 1750 and 1939. That wraps up this lecture. The next lecture will be on political processes, topic 4.2. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to Sultan Geography